There's a ridiculous and destructive stereotype in the West that whereas Westerners are linear thinkers and Westerners are rational, Westerners are concerned with truth and knowledge and reason, that Easterners are just these mush-headed, mystical, spiritual types, kind of New Agey California ditzes, people who don't give a care about what's truth, who don't really have an interest in rationality, who just want to seek God or just want to get in touch with their true self and things like that. Nothing can be farther from the truth. Indians are disputatious people, and I mean that in the best sense. As a philosopher who disputes for a living, I admire that about the Indians. And there are a number of great and long-lived schools of philosophy within the Hindu tradition. There have been a number of really notable, remarkable Indian thinkers. So in this segment, we'll look at a few of the disagreements within the Hindu tradition about how to understand their doctrine. When in the last segment I described samsara, the realm of reincarnation, in which all of us are trapped, I explained that that is a bad thing. It's something that we need to get out of. That's the presupposition. Of course, it sounded completely real. After all, it's a diagnosis of how the world really is. So then there really are souls. That's what we are. And we as souls really are trapped in a series of bodies, and it's really bad. However, some schools of Hindu philosophy think that this entire realm of samsara is unreal, or at least less real than Brahman, and is in some sense illusory. They think that samsara is a product of ignorance, and if ignorance was gotten rid of, then samsara would be gotten rid of. There are also plenty of disagreements about moksha. What is it, and why should we want it? All schools agree that it is freedom from rebirth. It brings an end to the reincarnation process. That much is clear. But beyond that, there's a lot of disagreement. One disagreement is, does it come in degrees or not? Is it an all-at-once thing? Is it all or nothing? Or can you obtain different degrees of moksha until you have the highest degree of it? Another disagreement is whether or not it is attainable in this life. If it's not attainable in this life, it's something you get only after you're out of the reincarnation cycle. There is, again, broad agreement that at its highest or ultimate stage, moksha involves a union, some kind of uniting between the ultimate and the person who gets liberation. But this is understood quite differently by different Hindu thinkers. Ones who we could call absolutists think that this is an ontological union, that you become Brahman or realize that you already are Brahman. In contrast to that, theistic Hindus think of this as a psychological or a relational union with a personal God, that is, with Brahman. For theistic Hindus, moksha is essentially going to heaven. You go to the realm where God is, and this unites you personally with your God, whom you love. It's a union of love. We're going to take a look now at 3 of the 6 traditional or orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy. We just don't have time to talk about all of them. As I mentioned before, there is a great philosophical tradition in India and in Hinduism, and I encourage you to take a course on Eastern thought that covers all the classical schools of Indian philosophy. But here's a very rough overview of 3 of them. First, there's the Sankhya or Samkhya school. This is a dualist school. It distinguishes between matter and self, says that reality fundamentally contains those 2 basic types of things. This school of philosophy is based on a philosophical text from probably the 4th century Common Era, so the 300s AD, in other words, although the school and some of its teachings are believed to be much older. The book is called the Samkhya Karakas by Ishvara Krishna. In any case, there are 2 basic kinds of things, prakriti, matter, and purusha, self. And self is defined as pure consciousness. There are many selves, and they actually deny that Atman is Brahman. In fact, they don't believe in any ultimate reality. They don't believe in any God in an ultimate sense. Thus, this school obviously contradicts the Upanishads. While originally it seems to have contained no ultimate being, no God, there are later versions of Samkhya school which do include God. In any case, your true self, your Purusha, has always been around. However, it is stuck in matter. It's trapped in matter. True insight, though, will allow you to gain liberation. And liberation is understood as just knowledge of one's true self. It's knowledge that you are Purusha and not Prakriti. And this liberating knowledge can be gained in this life. Furthermore, it's not your Purusha, it's not your soul or true self which reincarnates. It's rather your subtle body, something kind of soul-like, not normally observed. Your true self really hasn't been trapped, and if you knew that, you would have liberation. Your subtle body is trapped, but your subtle body isn't really you. There's quite a lot more one could say about this school and its doctrines, but the important thing to know about it here is that it is a fairly old school and that it influenced all the other schools of Hindu philosophy. Another of the traditional schools is the yoga school. Yoga here meaning just in general a discipline, like a spiritual discipline. And yoga has been closely associated with Samkhya. Some talk about the Samkhya yoga school. They combine the two schools and talk about them as one. Yoga can be theistic or absolutist. In other words, it can be centered around gaining a relationship to a personal God, or it can be centered around impersonal Brahman. The classic source, of course, is the Yoga Sutra, which we've mentioned a couple times before, by Patanjali. It's from the early Common Era, maybe 200 to 500 Common Era. What these disciplines are focused on is control of one's senses and one's body, and also control of one's own mind. Most of our minds, after all, are disorderly things. Through various exercise, they control posture, breathing, and thought, and they recite mantras. Mantras are basically phrases that are believed to have some type of power, some type of spiritually beneficial power. And all of these practical disciplines, all of these exercises have been incorporated into most forms of Hinduism. They've spread far beyond just the adherents of this one school of philosophy. Their goal is to attain a state of pure consciousness, a state in which you're conscious, but there's nothing of which you're conscious. There's no intellectual content to your awareness. They call this samadhi. Sometimes they describe it as the mind being absorbed into the ultimate or being one with it. Very often it is held out that if you can master these sorts of disciplines, not only will you ultimately get release, will you ultimately get moksha, but you will also get various superpowers. They believe that masters of these disciplines can sometimes fly or levitate or do various miracles, stop their own hearts from beating, can survive being buried alive, and so on. The third and last broad school that we'll look at is called the School of Vedanta. And in the last 200 years in Hinduism, this has by far been the most prestigious school of philosophy. Some people will just tell you that this is Hindu philosophy, or at least it's the pinnacle of Hindu philosophy. It traditionally was a scriptural school. It was based upon interpreting the Upanishads. Unlike some other schools, they upheld authorities of all the sacred writings that were traditional, the Vedas and the Upanishads and the others. There were many movements in India which, of course, denied the authority of those scriptures, such as Samkhya, and also any variety of Buddhism. Hinduism struggled against Buddhism in India for more than 1,000 years, and eventually Hinduism won out. There is hardly any Buddhism in India now. We'll save that story for a unit on Buddhism, though. Because it was traditionally so textually focused, it's a very philosophical school. The origin of it was in a writing called the Vedanta Sutra, also called the Brahma Sutra, written by a sage named Badarayana. It tries to systematize the claim that there is, in some sense, only one being, that Brahman is all there is. And it tries to clarify what it means to say that Atman is Brahman. One other basic thing to note about this school is that it's primarily Vaishnavite. Primarily consists of people in the wing of Hinduism which worship Vishnu as the ultimate. There are 3 big subgroups under the Vedanta school, and then there are also divisions within those. Here I'll stick to just the 2 biggest and most prestigious subgroups under this school, which are called Advaita Vedanta and Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. Dvaita means dual, so Advaita means non-dual or non-dualism. In other words, there's a distinction which is not being made. The distinction they have in mind, of course, is the famous statement of the Upanishads that Atman is Brahman. Advaita Vedanta says there isn't a distinction to be made. There isn't a difference between Atman and Brahman. They are not two, they are one. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta is usually explained as meaning qualified non-dualism. To put it very roughly, just as a first pass, they are also saying there, in some sense, isn't a distinction between Atman and Brahman, but in another sense there is. So they're not entirely one. There is a sense in which a distinction can be made, but in another sense you can't make a distinction. I'll try to be a little clearer about that in just a second. The most famous proponent, and the person who's usually considered as the founder of Advaita Vedanta, although some of this philosophy went back a little before his lifetime, is Samkhya or Shankara or Shankaracharya. He goes by many names. His dates are believed to be something like 788 to 820 Common Era. So we're talking about the Middle Ages here. His life has really become the stuff of legends, and scholars are skeptical about how much of it is accurate, but if the stories are to be believed, he was a great scholar and also a very pious person. He went all over India debating his opponents, refuting Buddhists and other kinds of Hindus, and standing up vigorously for what he viewed as the correct interpretation of the Upanishads. The founder of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta is Ramanuja, who died in the year 1137. He was a Vaishnavite priest and also a very notable philosopher, and very impressive as a philosopher in many ways. Moving on, the Brahman of the Upanishads, according to Advaita Vedanta, is an ineffable absolute, an inconceivable ultimate reality. It's pure consciousness. You can say what it's not, but you can't say what it is. In contrast, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta says that Brahman in the Upanishads really is the unique God, Ishvara, the Lord, that is to say, Vishnu. To say that Atman is Brahman just means that the one is the other. There is no difference between them. They are numerically one. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta says the deep self of everything is God. God is like a matter to all things. It's as if all things are made out of God. And again, he's like a soul inhabiting all things. So the world, but also your soul even, is like a body in which God lives. So the point is that God, Vishnu, is very closely related to everything. He does live within everything and inhabit everything. But at the end of the day, there is a difference between God and everything else. Here's an even bigger difference. Samsara, according to Advaita Vedanta, is illusory. The misapprehension of Brahman, they say, which is caused by ignorance. In contrast, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta says that samsara is real. It's not ultimate like God, but it is real. The multiple selves that we experience, right? I seem to be one person, you seem to be a different person. According to Advaita Vedanta, this distinction, this belief in multiple selves is an illusion. It's a mistake. All experience is really of Brahman, and we mistakenly divide Brahman into many things. Multiple selves, according to Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, are real. They're real, and they're really in bondage in samsara. The most important technique to get the cure, according to Advaita Vedanta, is knowledge. That is, this mystical insight, which is not easy to get, that Atman is Brahman. The most important technique to get the cure, according to Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, is devotion. That is bhakti. It's to love Vishnu, although that doesn't rule out loving Vishnu by way of loving some other deities as well. And finally, they differ in their understanding of the cure. Advaita Vedanta teaches that the cure is having non-conceptual awareness that Atman is Brahman. That's all the cure is the gain of that awareness. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta teaches that getting the cure is going to Vishnu's heavenly realm to enjoy him forever, which of course means that you will exist forever, and so will everyone else who gets this cure. So that's it for a very quick run through basic Hindu doctrines and the most prestigious components of traditional Hindu philosophy. And I hope that whets your appetite sometime to look more into traditional Indian philosophy, because really it's full of brilliant people and very interesting arguments. There is mysticism and mystical experience there, to be sure, but strangely enough, there's quite a lot of rational argument about it.